problems in the Corinthian church, the two main problems were the church forgetting the crucifixion of Jesus and the church doubting the resurrection of Jesus. And both these were related to the body, as we saw in the last presentation on Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And Paul addressed these two main problems in his first letter in the beginning, where he addresses them forgetting the crucifixion and doubting the resurrection at the end of his letter, that is 1 Corinthians. Now, the question that they had was, with regard to forgetting the crucifixion, was, why should a body nailed to a cross save the souls of sinners? And the doubt about the resurrection was, how can the physical body that is living in the world today have a new body? How can it be resurrected? And how can it be a new body? So Jesus was resurrected on the third day, and he had a new body which could eat, drink, live with the others. So these two problems related to the body, Paul addressed in his first letter to the Corinthian church. Now, moving on to the second letter of Paul to the Corinthian church, we can split this letter into three parts. The first part is from chapters 1 to 7, where Paul defends himself against the accusations of the church. And then chapters 8 to 9, where he instructs them about giving to the poor, because Paul wanted them to support the poor brethren in Jerusalem who were suffering from a severe famine. And so he wrote to encourage them to give towards famine relief. And then chapters 10 to 13, where he makes a seething attack on his accusers. Now, in the first letter, when Paul left Corinth, good leaders like Apollos and Peter came, and the church did well. But there was a problem with that, and the problem was that they started to compare Paul and Apollos with Paul. They started comparing minister to minister or leader to leader. Now, what we learn from that scenario is that as Christians, never compare our leaders, because each leader is different, and it was Christ who was crucified for us and not any human leader who was crucified for us. So never compare leaders. Now here, what the scenario is, we have false apostles who have taken over the Corinthian church, and they are accusing Paul of a lot of false accusations, and they are criticizing him severely. Some of the criticisms were that he was fickle and he was always always changing his plans. He was cowardly, and Paul was a timid leader. When he wrote letters, he was bold, but when he was with them in person, he was a timid leader. And he didn't have any testimonials or degrees or a letter of recommendation to be an apostle of the church or a leader in the church. Now, someone once humorously said, this is called emptying the church by degrees. So that was their accusation. And then they said Paul was very secretive. He was very aloof. He was uncaring. He was careless. And he was not a good speaker, or he was not a polished speaker. And the worst criticism was he doesn't charge a fee for preaching the gospel. And so these were severe criticisms against Paul by these false apostles and the church. The lesson from this scenario is never criticize someone. Never criticize someone. Because Paul has laid the foundation for them with the gospel. And the test now is how they build on the foundation that Paul has laid. And so, never criticize anyone for their work. Now, with all this going on, and with this background in mind, we look at Paul's defense of himself. Now, this letter is a very passionate, sincere letter or a response by Paul against all these accusations and criticisms. Paul really pours his heart out in response to their accusations. What does he say? He says, we were handicapped but never frustrated. We were puzzled but never in despair. We were persecuted but never alone. We were knocked down but we were never knocked out. And we want to prove ourselves genuine, sincere to the Lord who called us for this mission. Of course, there are many other things that he pours out as his defense, and we find those in chapters 1 to 7. As we read them, we will know. And then in chapters 10 to 13, of course, he breaks it up there, and then we find in chapters 8 to 9 where he's instructing them to give to the poor, to help them in Jerusalem. Maybe he wanted them to take their minds off themselves and look at the poor and give to the poor. And then in chapters 10 to 13, he makes a seething attack on his accusers. These are very strong words. If this defense was very tender and gentle and heartfelt, this attack on them is seething and very strong. He says to them, "In my eyes, you are like the fresh, unspoiled girl who I am presenting as fiancée to your true husband, Christ." And then he goes on to say, these special apostles are counterfeit. They are preaching a different Jesus to what we preached. And then he goes on to say, the Lord Jesus knows I am speaking the truth and how genuine my heart is for the gospel. All this attack on others is for the sake of the church at Corinth, to save them, and for the sake of the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ. Of course, these are only a few responses of attack, but if we read chapters 10 to 13, we get the full picture of this and Paul's response in attacking them in a tough way. And so this is a detailed study of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where this is the scenario, that is the background, or that is the context in which he writes this letter to them. Such an important study for us because we learn some very important lessons from this letter. So if you are a Christian leader holding a leadership position in the church or in the ministry, then we must read this letter again and again, because this letter is all about how leaders in the church, how leaders in the ministry should be, and how they should live their lives. May the Lord